you're introducing Rachel and doing the whole
Rachel is doing the introduction. That's right.
Yeah, I can kick us off. Thanks again for being part of our OAL webinar series. Good to have everyone here. If you're in person today or watching after the fact on the recording, which will be available later today. We have enjoyed the last couple of days of learning together and hope you have as well. Just a couple logistical things. We'll have time for questions at the end, 10 to 15 minutes of questions. If you keep yourself on mute, that will just help with background noise. And feel free to use the chat as well to list questions as they come up for you so you don't lose them. And we'll address them at the end. So let me pray for us and I'll hand it over to Dr. Karen Jahi. Heavenly Father, it's good to be together again, to learn, to think, to ask hard questions, and to be reminded of the ways that you're working in the world. I pray now that you would just soften our hearts and minds to what you have for us to learn today. Be with Mo as he speaks and leads us in this conversation, Lord, and give us hearts of gratitude as we just participate in a learning community together. In your name, amen.
Amen. All right. Well, thank you for being part of this seminar. So the topic today is fostering cultural diversity, specifically thinking of camps. I think a good thing would be to introduce myself as the person giving this. My name is Mohea Karienjahi, and many people call me Mo, and I am a Kenyan. I have lived in Kenya most of my life, so I am fully African, but have been part of the Outdoor Adventure Leadership Program and been here in the US for the last 10 years. And my deep interest in this topic comes from just the reality of being here in the Northwoods of Wisconsin and being basically looking different from the majority of the people, being quite a minority in this context. And I want to first say that, it has been an extremely hospitable place in terms of just people desiring to do good and to welcome me and to keep me included. However, in the other, and this is a term that was described by a philosopher, Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, otherness, those not like us. And that otherness does come to play every once in a while in my interactions, whether consciously or subconsciously. There are times where, as a minority, I do feel like, like I am the other. And especially in the last 10 years, the cultural context has really changed, even in the US. I would say, in my view, considering from 2014 until now, the real turning point was 2020, when there was the whole George Floyd killing, and at that point, just the emotional experiences that I had, and just watching what was happening around me got me very, very curious, and I took a deep dive into understanding just what is this that is in the US that makes cultural diversity such a complicated term, and also because it clearly has an impact, as we will be seeing in a few minutes, in the camp world. So that's where I'm coming from. And I just wanted to just pause there and say why the interest in this topic. And it's part hypothetical, but I'll give you about 10 seconds to begin crafting a response to that. Why would you be interested in this particular topic? And if you have a moment to jot it down, go ahead and do that. But I do want to keep moving here because I want to give space for you to ask questions at the end and for us to engage in conversation. So I'm a Kenyan and I'm in the United States. And there's this term that I learned from our brothers and sisters in our neighborhood here, the Native Americans, which is coming in a good way. Coming in a good way is coming in without making too many presumptions. You have, if people are hospitable towards you, then there's some expectations as a guest. And so I want to say that I am a foreigner and a guest, and where I come from, I hate I hate encountering what we call expats, expatriates who come and tell you, here's what's wrong with you. And this is not my attempt to say, hey, America, here's what's wrong with you. It is just an opportunity, I think, to be one who sees things a little differently, and to just take that opportunity then to engage in a conversation that would hopefully be good for the kingdom. There is a saying where I come from, that you do not shave the nape of your own neck. I could say it in my language, but the meaning is you need somebody to shave the back of your head. And I think, especially when you encounter people who are different from the majority, listening to them is important, because they can see what you might not see. And it's not one directional. I see myself through the eyes of other cultures all the time, and it is quite a positive experience. Quite frankly, it's how I grow, because I see things that I would otherwise not see if I did not listen and see myself through the eyes of other people. And then the final thing about me, and you may hear this right through the presentation, is my outlook is what you would call a liberation theology. It is believing that God will side with those who are disadvantaged and who are downtrodden, and you can learn more about liberation theology, but it's good to say it up front so that you know where I'm coming from with this. All right, and so my objective today is that we would do three things: explore some givens about the cultural diversity at camps in the US. What are the givens? What do we know? Consider some barriers to what I'm going to call the beautiful community, which is God's vision for diversity, wherever people are to be found and whenever it is possible. And then thirdly, we'll explore a framework of digging into lament as transformative learning that can potentially lead to being able to diversify spaces that are a little difficult to diversify. So that's where we'll be going. So let me start then with the givens. All right, so, by the givens, I'm going to approach it from two perspectives. I want to start from a theology, just crafting very briefly a theology of diversity. And there's an excellent text by Erwin Ince, 2020, the picture of the beautiful community. And his thesis is that God created people to be diverse, and he created them to live together so that we can know him better in our diversity. And the very first evidence of God and difference is the Trinity, the perichoresis of God. He exists in himself as three persons who are different and yet together. And one is not the other. The Father is not the Son is not the Holy Spirit, but then they exist as one. And that's the perfect picture of diversity that we can aim towards as we emulate him as the Imago Dei. And so right from the beginning, as he created us in Genesis, it says in Genesis 1:27 and 28, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And you can start seeing the difference that he was creating. And then it says in verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the earth and subdue it. And the reality is, in order to fill the earth that he had created, by design, people needed to be different to survive in the different parts of the earth that he had created. The people who live in the North Pole would necessarily be different from people who live in the Sahara, because they have adapted differently to those places. And so that kind of difference was definitely part of his design. And then just going down the road on Genesis, long story, and I'll move pretty fast through this. In Genesis 11, we encounter the story of Babel. And though it has been interpreted in many, many ways, I believe that what happened in Babel is what Irwin Innes calls ghettoization. And this is when people do not want to be separated. It is an environment where a group of people live and work in isolation. It is all about us. And what tends to happen then is people who live in isolation will have a bigger picture of who they are. And pretty soon the people in Babel are trying to challenge God. When they were building that tower, that's what they were doing. And that sameness became not only a strength in that they became very, very powerful, but it also became a danger because of idolatry. And so God scatters them. And so there's a whole school of thought, theologians who will say that that is what Genesis, the meaning of Genesis 11, one of the lessons that we can learn from Genesis 11. But then go to the very next chapter, chapter 12, and you encounter Abraham being given the covenant promise. And God says in Genesis 12, 2-3, I will bless you. And in verse 3, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse you. And all the people of the earth will be blessed through you. In other words, the whole story of the redemption that starts even at this point goes towards all nations, all the people of the earth. Whenever you encounter nations in scripture, the word is ethnos. And ethnos, and I know that that's Greek, that's New Testament language. Ethnos refers to ethnicities, and so nations do not exist quite in the way that we understand them as borders and political entities. Ethnicities existed at that time, and all the people of the earth would be blessed. So the blessing was for all the people, all ethnicities. And when we go into the New Testament, we see Jesus then really bending towards people who are different, the Samaritans, the women, people who are not highly valued. And after he has gone back to heaven, has been raised to go back to heaven, he leaves the Holy Spirit. And the birth of the church in Acts chapter 2 happens in a riot of diversity, which is what puzzled people, because people from all over the world could hear their languages be spoken by these people who are spirit-filled. And that should teach us about the multi-ethnic, multicultural church as part of this vision for us. And this continues, and I love Acts chapter 17 when Paul is talking to people in Athens, and he is explaining who God is. And he says in verse 26, Acts 17:26, from one man he made all the ethnos, all the ethnicities, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out the appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God is this, so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. And in that diversity, that there are different people living in all different places, then we look for God and we see him in a very different way. We see him as a multidimensional God who there is no one ethnicity that can know God fully. There needs to be different people from different cultural perspectives in conversation and understanding God from multi-directional in multi-directional ways. So for instance, people who see him as a very social and communal God might not see him as a very efficient God. And he is both. And we have to be in conversation in order to see that. And then the final picture of just the vision that God casts for diversity is Revelation 7:9, where he all the people of the earth, were worshiping him, and there are people from every nation, every language, every people standing before the throne and worshiping him. And so that is God's vision for the beautiful community. So let me move on then to talk about the Christian camping context. And this is where we look at how we look like here, specifically in the United States. And I'll do it in two parts. And one is look at the national demographic picture in the United States. And then I'll sort of focus in on Christian camps and see how that looks like. Now, it's no secret that in the United States has been getting more and more diverse. So that in 1963, when 3CA, CCI USA, as it was called then, was being started, 88% of the country was white. Right, and I'll come back to you using the terms white and black and all of that in a bit. So if you just hold, if that makes you uncomfortable. And then by 1990, there was that difference, a significant difference of over 10% decrease in the demographic portion that is white. By 2020, which is when the last census in the United States was done, 57.8 of the people in the country are white. And when you focus on the under 18s, which is that's our demographic as camp workers, under 18s, only 47.3 are white, meaning that the majority of the United States, those who are under 18, the majority are actually minorities. And projections are made that by 2045, there will be no majority in the country. There will be such a mishmash of people. And I think that is approaching the picture that God was painting. When you think about that trend and then you look at Christian camping, here's what it looks like. Right? And these are surveys that have been done by 3CA in 2000, which is the earliest sort of statistic that I could find that for demographics. 78% of Christian camping personnel populations were white. And that has changed in 20 years, but very, very minutely. If you can see that it has only changed by 3% in 20 years. So that in the last survey that was done just pre-COVID, which camps then were just what they had grown and emerged to be without being influenced by COVID. 75% of the people that at 3CA identified themselves as white. And this goes beyond Christian camping to outdoor spaces, right, and outdoor programming. And nationally, right at the end of COVID, in the middle of COVID, actually, I think it would be in 2020, people could not be together in inside spaces, but they could be outside. And so a lot of Americans went out, and it was a record in the national picture of who went into the outdoors. And 53% of all Americans ages 6 and above went for some outdoor recreation activity in 2020-21. And of those, 75% were white. This picture implies and points to the picture that it's not only Christian camping. Christian camping looks very much like the outdoor world in the bigger picture. So that being the picture, then I think the next natural question to ask would be, what are the barriers then that stand in the way of the national demographics being reflected in Christian camping, which is our concern. And so one of the things that I want to start is by saying that any conversations about race are complicated. And this will be a conversation about race. I'll try and explain as many of the terms as I can, as I understand them as an African, because I've had to learn them in 3 years. Christian camps are perceived as white spaces by minorities in the United States. And that is a barrier. Excuse me. And that is a barrier to minorities feeling like they can just go to any camp and be comfortable because they are stepping into a white space. And it is true that there are spaces in the United States where white people would be minorities and would be even alienated. But considering that the majority is still white, and especially in Christian camping, it's easy to find spaces where you're included, because that's a majority of Christian camping. And so let me just not spend too much time on that and go to just saying that my desire is not to shame, to shame any white folks who are listening to this, but to basically press into what it says in 2 Corinthians 7, 10, 11, that, hopefully as we think about this, we would engage in some sorrow, because this is not the way things are supposed to be, but it's godly sorrow that leads to salvation and leaves no regret, and not worldly sorrow that brings death. And any conversation on race that attacks the person, that does not engage people with respect, is worldly sorrow. God wants us to engage in this from a different perspective. Why do I choose to use the language of race and whiteness and all of that? First, let me make it clear that I do believe all of us belong to one race. It's Genesis 1:27. I just read it. And that much later, somewhere along the way, race was created. The word race became a term that referred to color and culture and skin tone. And in the late 19th century, some people even went ahead in order to affirm race and engaged in faulty science, what is now known to be faulty science, eugenics, to prove that people of different colors had different attributes in terms of intelligence and humanness. And that conversation had to do with economics, it had to do with many, many things, but race is a social construct. It's not something that we find in scriptures. We will find ethnicity in scriptures, but not race. Whenever the term race is used, it's accompanied by a hierarchy. That's just the natural thing. And at the top of that hierarchy is whiteness. Whiteness is also a construct, a human construct that galvanates people, usually of Eurocentric, origins, and it was not always so. As we think about the United States, it was not always the case that people from different parts of Europe were considered as equals. We know of times when to be Italian was hazardous, or to be Irish, but at some point it became convenient to have everybody then be white, and that is in comparison to other people who are also attributed a color. So I am an African, and here I've been wrestling and exploring what does it mean to be black, and yet my skin is not quite black. It is a darker tone, but it is not black. Neither are people who are referred to as white, really white. It is a social construct. And this has become so normalized, the hierarchies and the dynamics that surround those hierarchies, that to ignore the language of race is really to step out of reality. You cannot live in the United States, which has been called quite a racialized country. You just need to look at the politics right now, and the cultural moment, and not engage in this language. So I do so. I wish there was better terminology to use, but it is what it is, and it is the reality. And in order to have handholds to deal with diversity in the United States specifically, the language of race is unavoidable. So this crisis of lack of diversity has been felt in the church as well. I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said that the most segregated hour in the United States is on Sunday morning during church. And the church has been wrestling with this, and theologians and sociologists, and even people who cannot really name it, they agree that the first step in dealing with this challenge is to lament. And lament is a complex word. It is an expression of grief over what is not right. You feel something is not right, and you express the grief. Now, how do you do that? Well, this is what I want to try and expound on so that you can have handholds on wrestling with that, because we can hold hands and cry and that won't change anything. But we can act in ways that are informed and hopefully begin to change the picture. So here's a good first place in dealing with lament. This is a definition by a white South African, Denise Ackerman, in a letter to her children, actually. She was talking about being white in South Africa years after apartheid and the impact of apartheid that you still feel. And so she was calling her children to lament, and she describes lament as both communal and individual. And, I could expound on each one of these. It needs to be public and private. It is also the language of both the suffering victim, whatever the situation may be, but also of the penitent people. In other words, lament by one party doesn't lead to reconciliation. Lament by both does, which is why I borrowed an African saying, that says you cannot kill a bug with one finger. You need two fingers to kill a bug. And lament calls God to account. And at the same time, it calls upon God for relief. And she goes on to say, it is never an end to itself. It is undergirded by the hope that God not only can, but that he will hear the cries of the suffering and the penitent and will act with mercy and compassion. And scripture is full of situations like that. He had the Israelites when they were in slavery, when they lamented and cried out to him. All right, enemies of lament. As we look at barriers, lament immediately. It's not a natural thing in the cultural milieu. Being in the United States, it's not one of the first things that comes to mind. This is a pretty upbeat society, and so instantly, it's a society that will celebrate faster than mourn. And here are some of the things that have been identified by Emmanuel Katongole and Chris Rice as enemies of lament. And they've written a chapter in their book, All Reconciling All Things, that I'll be pressing into, and I'll be using their framework to create some handholds for lament that can help us on this journey. So they talk about speed, being one of the enemies of lament. And as you think about this context and even things that we experience every day, people brush aside the conversation of diversity quite easily. I have been in a church situation where somebody said, stop, let's not use the word diversity anymore. And I begged to differ, unfortunately. It is a strategy for not seeing. I'm going to use a bit of imagery from Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan here. And you know the story, so I won't go into it. But I can see the priest and the Levite, when they found their poor countryman, this was their own man who was injured. I can see their pace increasing. If you read it, and they saw him and immediately moved to the other side of the road, right? I can see them moving, walking faster. Can't you see that happening? When you don't want to see something, you increase your speed. And then distance is the other enemy. And this is avoidance, getting away from things as fast as possible. And it says the priest and the Levite actually cross to the other side, and you create barriers so that you cannot see and understand what it is that makes you uncomfortable. And then the third strategy or enemy of lament is innocence. And this is when you sweep things under the rug. I did nothing wrong. You quickly, I can see how the priest and the Levite went on to whatever their destination was and never talked about what had happened. and probably didn't reflect on what had happened. I'll press into each of these in just a bit as I go deeper into the discipline of lament, which I want us to spend about the next 20 minutes talking about, and then I'll leave some time for questions. All right, so the discipline of lament, they propose, Emmanuel Katongole and Chris Rice, what they propose is that you have to unlearn these enemies of lament, and you do that by learning something else. You learn a response to speed, which they call pilgrimage. You learn a response to the temptation to create distance by relocation, and I'll explain what that is. And then innocence by public confession. Because we are experiential educators, we know Kolb's experiential cycle, right? Whenever we're going into an experiential activity. I'm going to use another cycle that is the transformative learning cycle by Jack Merseyrow. And he talks about experiences that you engage in that challenge your assumptions, which is not very different from what we do in Christian camping. You challenge your assumptions. And if you allow your assumptions to be challenged, then there's possibility of transformative learning, so that when you enter into the same situation again, perhaps your assumptions will have changed. But it's a cycle that continues. So it's not fix it quickly and it is done, but a continuous process. So I'll press into that a bit more. So let me look at speed first. And I said it's I'll talk about, there's a text that is quite well known, Divided by Faith, which is reporting on a study down in the United States, just hundreds of churches, conversations about race in hundreds of churches by Christian Smith and Michael Emerson. 2001 is when the book came out. And they coined the term having cultural tools that help the majority avoid conversations. Right? And some of the temptations that are in the cultural tools are fixing things quickly. Like when you actually start seeing that something is wrong, you fix it quickly. This is part of the strength of being American. Actually, America is a country of solutions. We have many solutions to any problems that arise. And then another thing they identify is colorblindness. And colorblindness is when you deny that there is any difference. And I think sometimes it is well-intentioned to see everybody as the same, but it really just skims the surface and avoids dealing with issues that are real. It would definitely go against us seeing God as the Immaculate Day if we paint him as ourselves by being colorblind. And then there's personal innocence. America is a fairly individualistic community, society, where if it's not my fault, if I didn't do it, then it's difficult to take on the consequences or to wrestle with the consequences. And so the story goes, if things happened many years ago, why am I having to lament over them? I had nothing to do with it. And then finally, minimizing. Quick explanations as to what's going on, and some, it's an outcome of non-racial dynamics such as free market. Maybe it's too expensive for minorities to go to camp, that kind of thing. Pilgrimage as a way to unlearn speed is a way of slowing down until you are disturbed. It is actually embracing disturbance. When you go on pilgrimage, you don't go jogging, you go slowly and you want to experience the journey. And I'm going to dig into it in 3 directions: backwards, inwards, and outwards, and spend a bit of time talking about that. And so it's going to be longer than the other 2 responses to the enemies of lament. So the pilgrimage needs to begin backwards. And this is by looking back at history. What might history have to do with our present circumstance? What lingers? And as you think about especially the outdoors, the question would be to ask, what has been the experience of minorities in the United States in the outdoors? And you quickly run into not so long ago when there was lynchings that would happen in the outdoors. And even before that, now it's well over 200 years ago, then, when there was slavery. And it was very unsafe for people, minorities, to be out there because they could be kidnapped even if they belong to the free side of the United States. Ignoring that doesn't help because the people who are minorities, Americans, they have what is called collective memory. They're the stories that are passed down from generation to generation. And even as an African, I can remember because of reading and hearing the news when my two sons came of age and they were driving, I had to tell them to always hold the steering wheel with both their hands if they're pulled over by the police because of the history of police violence that has happened in this country. Jamar Tisby, in his book, The Color of Compromise, points at the church and its complicity to the history of injustices. And that is a book that I would really recommend. And here's another thing that I'd like to point out, that many of our camps in the United States are in wonderful, beautiful parts of the United States, all over the states, next to lakes and mountains. These are places that were once occupied by Native Americans and must ask ourselves the history of how they lost their land. And it may have been 100 years ago, whatever it was, but the reality is that they still suffer the consequences of some of the removals from their land and the cultural genocide that happened at that time. Ignoring Native Americans, and I'm going to dare say that any camp that you're listening from, if it's in the United States, you probably have some indigenous people living around you, but they are often invisible. And I learned that from just being here in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. And so there is non-recognition is one strategy. Misrecognition is when you stereotype them and just say, oh, they are this. And many times what people say about Native Americans is they suffer from a lot of addictions, right? And that is the end of the conversation. And then there's exploitation. And what many camps have done, and I'm going to ask you to look around in your own camp, is looked and is stolen some of the artifacts of the Native Americans, and the only evidence that they were ever there are in your camps, places that they would find difficult to come to. And the word for that is cultural appropriation, which is a form of injustice. So we need to look backwards, and there are consequences from the past that influence how camps are perceived today. The second pilgrimage is inward. And I'm actually borrowing here from Alcoholics Anonymous. They say, second rule number 4 is we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And one of the Insight magazines from 3CA, this is fall 2020, has a lot of wonderful articles on cultural diversity, and I'd encourage you to read that if you have a moment. But here's what Sam Collier, who is a person of color who is a camp director, writes. He says, you should be asking yourselves, where could racism show up right now? If we believe that it is there, where is it? When you think about all the elements of Christian camping, from staffing, do all the people that are in your staff represent one culture? Because that will mean that people from other cultures might not feel like that place belongs to them. Or to the worship styles, right? And I don't need to say too much about that. Is your worship at camp diverse? To preaching, to the attendees in your camp, when you look at all these areas, could it be that racism or systemic oppression? And this is when it's structural racism and structural oppression. You don't really need to do anything. It is around us. It is historical. It is legal. And if you want to ignore it, it is easy to ignore. But could it exist? And could it be part of the reason why there's lack of diversity at your camp. And I would encourage you to then use data, evaluations, feedback. Hopefully you do that every summer. And I know we will have seminars that will talk about evaluation at some point. What are the minorities that camp saying, and to pay attention to them? And when they say they were bullied, or they felt lonely, or they didn't feel heard. And then there can be facilitated processes, holding conversations, maybe inviting people who can help you to see what your camp looks like from minority eyes. I'm speaking from HoneyRock, and I do know, and right next to our former director, and we did invite, cultural representatives who came and looked around the camp and did an inventory and were able to point out and say, this can be alienating, and that practice might not be that inclusive. And then there are team processes that you can do. And I'm going to just propose two and not dig too much into it, but action learning is something that you can do without facilitation. It's where you ask yourselves questions as you're trying to especially find solutions and get to collaboratively to answer. And same with collaborative inquiry. And this is something, these are terminologies that you could search and see the processes. They're quite manageable, right? With the staff without facilitation, right? And then pilgrimaging outward is really listening to people out there. And I recommend listening to minorities, listening to the margins, people from the margins. And this book by Denise Edwards proposes that for churches. I think this is true too of Christian camping. And so I would encourage folks to think about getting into partnerships with camps. There's 5% of the camps in America are minority camps. If you can get into conversations with those camps, they can help you begin to understand what some of those tension points are that make your camp have a hard time becoming more diverse. And I have some bullet points here. I just want to say temporary community is a great strength of camp, but it's also very easy to become insular because of the whole idea of temporary community. Yes, we're trying to get away from permanent community, but can we use opportunities during temporary community to engage with what's happening around in society? For instance, when the race protests were happening in 2020, it was in the summer. And I wonder how many camps brought those conversations in as an educational opportunity, a ministry opportunity for their campus. Invisible neighbors, I talked about usually the Native Americans, or camps that may be white, but most, and I'm thinking about our own camp here in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, a very white area, but many of our campers come from hundreds of miles away. They come from Chicagoland, where there's a lot of diversity. And being able to look out that way and see, we really are not capturing this demographic, can also be a way of pilgrimaging and asking why, right? And when you go out, you are looking for relationships. You're not going to fix things. You're going, this is a searching pilgrimage, is a searching journey. And then finally, just I think I talked about basically still being in the world. So pilgrimaging outward. And then I'll go into distance, for which unlearning distance, we said was relocation. Distance is when you downplay disparities. You minimize, ignore reports of microaggressions and doubt people when they say, I felt slighted. Alienating practices, looking out for practices that immediately alienate minorities. For example, many minorities do not grow up with a lot of the activities that are done at camps. Swimming might not be their strength. And so when a diverse group comes to a camp, we need to figure out how we do our swim tests, because that could immediately alienate the minorities. And then, just don't ignore collective memories and land issues. These are things that I've talked about. And I've also talked about personal holiness. I didn't do it, so it has nothing to do with me, as a strategy for distance. And I want to propose that relocation actually emerges from pilgrimage. Which is why it's sounding very familiar already. The distance sounds very familiar. It's what you learn from pilgrimage. How do you engage it, and how do you make changes? How do you enter from the comfortable existence and go into an in-between of learning? And that is the liminal space of change. And liminal space is uncomfortable. You cede control. It's just like how when you go to camp, you're not sleeping in your comfortable, bedroom with the bathroom right next to you. You're in shared facilities. There's some loss that happens when you step into liminal space. It is practicing sacrificial hospitality. What is it going to cost us to make changes that actually become more inclusive? For instance, does your camp need to set aside specific times during the summer, the peak season, where you have camps that are for minorities? I don't know whether that's what's right for your camp, but questions like that, sacrificial hospitality. And then to recognize that the liminal period will be long. I've written there, the slow word of God. It's a poem by Teilhard de Chardin, and I encourage you to just Google the slow work of God and read that poem, because it gives us the sense of how much patience we have to exercise as we go into relocation. And then finally, looking at innocence. Innocence explains away disparities. This innocence is what we experience most outwardly. The other two may be implicit, but innocence is what we say when we say that history has nothing to do with this. When we say, oh, but this is what our camp does, and this is our tradition, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is when we assign blame to others for their laziness or their culture doesn't like camp. One of the most painful statements I've heard in the United States is that minorities don't like to camp. That is absolutely not correct. And when you engage in language such as White Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter in response to Black Lives Matter, and I know these are very loaded terms, it is a way of saying, I'm innocent, I matter too. It is like ignoring a whole forest burning to say, I'm going to look at my little stove and make sure that my water is not boiling over. I know it's an imperfect example, but that's how it is. And with innocence, public confession. This is basically what we recognize lament as. It's when we invite people to rituals that publicly own and embrace the journey. And again, it flows out of pilgrimage and relocation, those first two steps. It is when you actually start thinking of things like restorative justice. I mentally mentioned just a bit that restorative justice, especially when you think of things like land issues, that's complex, because you ask yourself, what do we do then if we're on stolen land? I'm going to call it stolen land. Does that mean you give up your camp and invite your neighbors to come and take it over? That really doesn't make sense. And yet the scriptures in Numbers chapter 5, it says, if you discover there has been an injustice, you restore those who have lost and you give them 20% over. My point, it's a complicated conversation to get into. You don't want to kill a camp just for the sake of killing it. Make rituals of changes and convictions that you gain. Here's what I want to say, is that it is very easy to make changes by sweeping what was wrong under the rug. If you discover something that was not right at your camp, what if you make a ritual of it? What will your campus learn? What will your staff learn? Will you be teaching them how to lament well? If you make a ceremony of confession and making the changes ceremonially and making commitments to actually live differently. And then finally, engage resistance graciously and patiently. You know, the implications of what we've been talking about, this is what you need to be ready for. That if you get into this process, enemies of lament fight back. And if you're pressing into lament, you need to be patient, because not everybody has the same amount of reflection as you have done just in the last 40 or 50 minutes. All right, so let me stop there and give us the last 10 minutes or so, open up to any questions that you all might have out there, or enter into conversation, whether within the room or out there.
So feel free to unmute and bring any questions or put them in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Out there.
Oops. So Josie, I'm curious, given what you said of why you're here, how does this impact international staff, which is different from kind of the racial minority mindset of the US? What do you think are things that you can interpret into your unique question?
Was that a statement by Josie or a question by Josie?
It's in her comments.
Okay. Josie, I'd be curious as to what you think.
Yeah, I think something that immediately came to mind, because I think when just thinking about like how is diversity reflected on our staff, you know, when you were talking about like speakers and different things, I think a big one that I haven't thought about a ton is specifically our summer worship. Like how does that reflect different things? Because I shared Muhi, I don't know if you got to see it, but we've just had a huge increase in international applications for summer staff. And so we have a decent amount this year, mostly coming from, I think they're all from South Africa, but a lot of different places also applied. We couldn't like quite work with all of the different places this year. But just keeping, that's something why it's kind of on my mind more, is just knowing that we have that increase. Yeah, and wanting to do that well.
Yeah, and this is true of many camps now in the US, just because getting counselors local counselors has gotten a bit harder than it was before. International staff are just opportunity, big time opportunity, especially for the inward pilgrimage, when you want to look at your practices. And actually it gives you sort of a pass, because their histories are different from the American history. So you can really go into how are our practices right now? And this is when you start seeing what is alienating. So when you start having people slow down, that's when you have people start thinking, how can we make sure that staff members are not isolated? We have a practice at HoneyRock of inviting a lot of international staff. Last year, it was more than 10% of all our staff were international, and we're aiming even higher this year. And we do it knowing it is a messy, complicated process, right? And I see one of our international staff is actually on the screen. And we love it. We love the complexity because it is a learning journey. And I remember the first time that we had international staff at HoneyRock, and it was time for feedback. And something that we would never think of, that the loneliest time for international staff is when all the staff have a day off. And the people who are suffering from cabin fever will jump into their cars and leave. And the international staff are left and they can't go anywhere. They don't have vehicles. And so addressing things like that you really cannot see unless you see it through the eyes of a different person, that can be just a beautiful way for you to start getting more and more sensitive in ways that can also speak into the national picture of diversity. That's what I would say. And I don't know if anybody else would like to comment on that. But have fun, Josie. It's an adventure for sure. Super fun.
I would like to comment on that. As
Yes,
part of international staff, I'm from Argentina, and I can see myself last year at HoneyRock, and like international support was really important for us. And I'm so thankful for like HoneyRock gave us those spaces that we can show our culture. Because it is kind of difficult when you don't speak the same language, your times are switched. Like for me, things I don't know, like having dinner at 5 p.m. was a huge change. We are used to have dinners, I don't know, at 9 or 10 p.m. Or I don't know, like for us it's common to see each other and say hi, hello, and give us a hug or a kiss in the cheek. And people in the US were like kind of distant with that. So I think adaptation, like getting used to it a week before or some days before, it's really important because we can know the culture, and we can embrace that too. Like it's not that easy for an international to work with in another country, but it is possible, and it's an adventure, and it's really fun to learn and to feel like the others are learning from you too.
Thanks, Sophia. And here, let me add my 2 shillings worth as an international staff member at HoneyRock for many years, that you get a pass also because the perspective of international staff is we want to learn so that we can adjust. And when I came to the United States, I knew it was going to be a different culture. And most of the mistakes I made was because I did not know. I was not going to force myself to, the system into bending to accommodate my the fact that I know how to drive on the left side of the road. That wouldn't make any sense. However, as you think about minorities who are Americans, coming into white spaces means that they have to subjugate their own culture and live in a different way and have to change in their own country. This is their home. As international staff, we know we have other homes. They're not, if people are refugees, maybe they can't quite go back. But for people who have grown up within a culture and a country that has a high value for equality, it is quite unfair to have them be the ones who are always having minorities, be the ones who are always having to subject themselves to a culture that then is seen as the normal. Right? Oh, we're almost to the top of the hour. I have 1 or 2 more slides there. Lots and lots of resources that you can go into. And if you're quick, you can take a picture of that. But I also want to actually give a better resource. And this is everything that I've spoken about is in an article from the Christian Scholars Review in much greater depth. So if you scan the QR code, that will lead you to the article, and you can enjoy the offering. All right, back to you.
Very good. Thank you for that. We will be posting a link to all 3 presentations over the last couple days. We'll share it via email with everyone that filled out our initial form, so feel free to log in and view those again or share them with others in your organization. We also have on Monday an informational meeting for anyone interested in going deeper with any of this. If this kind of type of learning and the topics we've been wrestling with strike a chord with you, and there's something that you think might be important to press into in a more formal fashion, our MA in outdoor ministry, we have a couple different formats for that for various stages of experience. And we'd love to spend some time with you talking about that. So look out for that link as well. Otherwise, it's been great to have you with us, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you all for participating in this or watching it later.